Nathan sat in the dimly lit barracks, the rhythmic hum of the bass settling into the background like a constant, familiar noise. At 42 years old, he had seen his fair share of conflict, but today was different. Today was like any other day in the life of a soldier. Routine, methodical, predictable. He had just finished his morning run, the sweat on his brow now cooling as he sat on the edge of his bunk, tying his boots with practiced precision. The rest of the soldiers in his unit had already begun their own morning routines, some chatting over breakfast, others focusing on their tasks. But for Nathan, there was no rush. There was no place he needed to be except here, with his thoughts, mentally preparing for another long day. Nathan had been a part of the 82nd Airborne for the better part of 2 decades. His life had been built around discipline, sacrifice, and responsibility, values ingrained in him since his early days in the Army. Every day was a repeat of the one before it. Training, strategizing, mission prep. There was comfort in the routine, in the predictability of it all. Outside the base, he had a life that he always believed was stable. Becky, his wife of 13 years, was his constant anchor. They had built a life together in Spokane, bought a house, shared quiet evenings, and built a future around their shared dreams. He wasn't the type of man who demanded much. Loyalty, honesty, and respect were the cornerstones of his life. When he was deployed, his heart was always at ease knowing that, while he was away, Becky was holding down the fort. He trusted her implicitly, as he did the Army. But as Nathan prepared for another day in Kandahar, an email slipped into his inbox, its subject line blunt and unfeeling, "Let's be adults about this." He opened it casually, expecting a standard check-in or something minor. Instead, the words hit him like a brick. "We need to talk. I think it's best if we part ways." 3 sentences. That's all it took to shatter the calm that had defined his life for so long. Becky had already filed for divorce, emptied their joint account, and moved in with her new boyfriend, Jeremy. Nathan closed the laptop, stood, and took a long, steady breath. The noise of the barracks seemed to fade into the distance as he walked toward the communal shower. There were no outbursts, no phone calls to friends or family, just silence. He understood what had happened, even if he couldn't yet process it fully. Back at his bunk later that night, he typed one word in response: understood. The weeks that followed the email were marked by a strange, suffocating quiet. Nathan's daily routine didn't change, not on the surface. He still woke up early for his morning run, still sat with the same soldiers at the mess hall, and still went through the motions of a life that had become second nature. But inside, something shifted. It began subtly, the unease gnawing at him like a splinter lodged beneath his skin. Nathan didn't speak much about his personal life, especially not here. He'd learned long ago that it wasn't the place for such things. So when his fellow soldiers asked about home, he gave them the same rehearsed answers: "Becky's good. Everything's fine." They didn't pry further, and neither did he. But the calls home had started to feel different. At first, he blamed it on the time zone, on the stress of their daily routines. Becky's voice, once warm and familiar, had become distant during their conversations. He thought nothing of it at first. She was probably tired, adjusting to the changes of daily life without him. But after a few weeks, the signs grew harder to ignore. The phone calls became shorter, more rushed. The voice that had once eagerly asked about his day now seemed to lose its energy, as if she were simply going through the motions. "How was your day, Nate?" she would ask, but her voice lacked the usual interest. He would tell her about the grueling training, the hours spent reviewing intel, but it felt like he was talking to someone who was already mentally checked out. He never questioned her outright. He knew her too well to accuse her without proof. Still, something was off. He noticed, for the first time, the way she avoided his question. "What's going on with you, Becky?" he had asked one night, the concern slipping through despite his best efforts to remain composed. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before she answered, "Nothing, Nate. I'm just tired. You know how it is." There was always something. Always an excuse. Always a reason for why she wasn't available, why she couldn't talk. At first, it seemed innocent enough. She was busy, she was adjusting to life without him. She didn't need to be asked why she'd started going to the gym 3 times a week, or why she came home late from work more often. But then came the new clothes, the change in her social circle, the new friends she casually mentioned, but never fully introduced. It was like the more Nathan tried to connect, the further away she seemed to get. One night, as Nathan sat on his cot staring at the small, dim lamp in his barracks room, he found himself scrolling through their old messages. The texts had once been full of affection, playful jokes, and plans for the future. But now, as he read through them, it became clear, they had shifted. Where once there were endearing notes, now there are just functional updates, had a good day at work, or, just got home, it's late. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. He couldn't. But the changes in Becky's tone were undeniable, like cracks slowly forming in a once sturdy foundation. His mind lingered on the little things, the way she stopped saying, "I love you," at the end of their calls, how she no longer mentioned their future together. They used to talk about where they wanted to go on vacation when he came home. They used to plan the house improvements they'd make together, little projects that felt like dreams. But now, there are no plans, no mention of the future, only the present. And even that seemed distant. It wasn't just the phone calls or the lack of affection. There were small changes in her behavior that Nathan noticed, details that seemed insignificant at first, but slowly added up. One afternoon, as he was reading through some mission reports, he received a text from Becky. "Hey, I'm going to be out with some friends tonight. Don't wait up." The words themselves were harmless, but it was the timing that struck him. She'd been making plans without him. She was living without him. His stomach tightened as he thought back to the months before his deployment. He had noticed the distance then, too. The missed calls, the late nights at work, the unspoken tension in the air. But he hadn't said anything. He'd thought it was just the strain of the distance. Now, looking back, he could see the slow unraveling, the moments that, when pieced together, formed a picture of a woman who had moved on without him. Nathan wasn't the kind of man to confront issues head-on without solid evidence. It wasn't his way. He wasn't impulsive, and wasn't emotional. He thought carefully, took his time to process, to make sure he wasn't misinterpreting things. But the nagging feeling in the back of his mind wouldn't go away. He knew something was coming. His gut told him so. But what exactly? What had Becky been hiding? He didn't know. He didn't want to know. But he would find out. Slowly, methodically, Nathan began to make his own moves. Nothing overt, nothing flashy, just precautions. He wasn't blind, and he wouldn't be caught off guard. He had placed some important documents in a storage unit across town, documents that only he could access. The house deed, their marriage license, his military pension papers, small things that might matter if everything came crashing down. Nathan also opened a separate bank account. Not much, just a small portion of his pay that he could divert without raising suspicion. It wasn't enough that Becky would notice, but it was enough that, if the worst came to pass, he wouldn't be starting from zero. But even as he took these quiet steps, the unease continued to grow. The small signs kept accumulating, one after the other. Missing calls, unexplained absences, the feeling that his life was slipping from his grasp, little by little. And somewhere deep inside, Nathan knew that, when the truth finally came, it would not be pretty. But whatever came next, he was ready. He would face it with the same calm, measured resolve that had gotten him through every challenge in his life. The truth would come out, and he would handle it. It was only a matter of time. As Nathan settled into the monotonous routine of his deployment, the weight of what he suspected began to press on him. The months passed, but the quiet ache of the betrayal gnawed at him. His mind stayed alert, his focus sharp, but underneath that calm exterior, something was stirring. The isolation grew more pronounced with each passing day. He was surrounded by men who, just like him, had left their lives behind to serve. But even as they chatted over meals or swapped stories about home, Nathan couldn't escape the creeping sense of separation from the one person who had once been his everything. Every phone call with Becky felt more strained. The excuses were endless. She was tired, busy, had to meet friends, or work late. What should have been moments of connection had become hollow. He had started to notice how the sounds of their conversations seemed different. Her voice lacked warmth, no longer a soothing comfort. In the few words she did speak, there was always a slight edge of impatience, as if she couldn't be bothered by his concerns. The conversations were clipped, transactional, no longer the loving exchanges they had once shared. The small signs started to add up. The late-night texts with her new friends, the way she avoided questions, how she'd cut their weekly calls short, how she started saying, "good night," without the usual, "I love you." But Nathan didn't allow himself to indulge in anger or suspicion. He wasn't the kind of man who let emotions dictate his actions. He stayed quiet, kept his head down, and watched carefully. It wasn't until he noticed the strange charge on their joint credit card that he began to take real action. It was a small amount at first, a dinner reservation at a restaurant he didn't recognize, followed by another charge at a boutique he knew Becky had never visited. Nathan had always kept track of their finances, especially with the unpredictable nature of military life. So when these charges appeared, he could sense something was wrong. The next day, he went through their bank statements again, carefully scrolling through the endless pages of transactions. What had once seemed like simple, everyday purchases now felt like discrepancies. The small amounts grew larger, more dinners, more gifts, more unexplained charges. Each one felt like a knife twisting a little deeper. And it wasn't just the money that was disappearing, it was the trust he had in her. Nathan began to dig. He opened the emails from the bank and started cross-referencing them with her usual spending habits. Nothing overt, nothing obvious, just a slow, creeping realization that Becky had been quietly siphoning money. But the most disturbing discovery was the bank transfer. Nathan had been with the military long enough to recognize an automatic withdrawal when he saw one. It was a transfer to an account in Becky's name, but this one was different. This wasn't a routine payment to a shared bill or savings account. This was an amount that didn't fit. A large sum, taken from the account without any prior warning. It was one of those red flag moments that made his pulse quicken, but he kept himself under control. His thoughts remained methodical, detached. It wasn't enough to confront her just yet. He needed more, needed to gather the evidence to understand the full extent of her actions. Nathan wasn't a man to act impulsively. His training in the army had taught him to think through his decisions before making them, especially when it came to something as serious as this. He knew that if he moved too soon, he might scare her off, or worse, she could hide her tracks. He needed a clear plan. In the dead of night, when the others were asleep and the barracks were quiet, Nathan sat at his small desk, lit only by the harsh glow of his laptop. His fingers typed with deliberate precision as he accessed the home security system. He had installed cameras when he bought the house years ago, convinced it would provide a sense of safety. Now, it felt like his lifeline. The footage played out on the screen. There was Becky, moving around the house. It was the mundane things at first, the way she stood by the kitchen counter, looking out the window, or the way she walked through the living room. But then, something caught Nathan's eye. A man. A stranger, tall and broad-shouldered, with short, dark hair, walking his dog. Nathan's pulse quickened as he recognized the dog. It was theirs. But the man was a stranger. This wasn't someone Nathan had ever seen before, not anyone they had ever invited over. The man lingered outside for a moment, took the dog for a short walk around the yard, then walked back inside. Nathan's stomach turned as he saw Becky laughing in the kitchen. That was the moment everything became clear. He closed the laptop, his mind working quickly. This wasn't just about finances anymore. This was bigger. The man in their house, Becky's new boyfriend, had to be Jeremy, the name he had heard only briefly in passing. His gut had told him that something was wrong, but now he had the proof. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was emotional. She had moved on long before he had left, and now, her actions had sealed it. But Nathan remained calm. His reaction was not one of rage, nor was it one of sadness. Instead, it was one of clarity. This was no longer about the man she was seeing. This was about his own next steps. It wasn't about confronting her yet, or even about taking revenge. It was about getting justice and securing his future. The next morning, Nathan found himself going through his documents again, checking his military pension account, reviewing the status of their home loan, and making sure everything was in order. He needed to be prepared. If Becky thought she could simply take what she wanted, she had another thing coming. He opened a new tab on his laptop and contacted James, an army buddy turned lawyer, with one simple line in the subject line: "Need legal help. Discreet and urgent." The response came within an hour. James was thorough. They spoke briefly but precisely. Nathan could hear the concern in his voice, but it was also clear that his mind was already working through the same calculations Nathan had. There was a plan in place, and Nathan would follow it through. This wasn't about fury. This was about reclaiming control. His life, his assets, his dignity, none of it would be taken from him. Not without a fight. Not without a plan. And so, as the days bled into weeks, Nathan's path became clear. It wasn't just about confronting Becky, it was about making sure that her betrayal would cost her, not him. Every move was calculated, every conversation purposeful. And as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Nathan knew that when the time came, he would be ready. The day Nathan had been preparing for had arrived. He sat in the dim light of his barracks room, eyes steady on the screen of his laptop, where everything he had carefully gathered over the past weeks lay in front of him. Emails, bank statements, security footage, and his communication with James. All of it had led him here. He didn't feel anger or sorrow. Those emotions had long since faded into a quiet, calculating resolve. What mattered now was that the truth was clear, and it was time to act. He had waited for this moment for so long, but he didn't feel any sense of triumph. No, this wasn't about winning or losing, it was about regaining control of his life. The woman who had once been the center of his world had betrayed him, but now he had the evidence to ensure that her actions wouldn't go unpunished. With a deep breath, Nathan picked up his phone. He had already briefed James on his plan, and the lawyer was ready. The quiet ring of the phone felt like a countdown as it connected. On the other end, James picked up quickly. "I'm ready," Nathan said, his voice steady. "Understood," James replied. "We're in position. Let's move." Nathan's pulse quickened, but only just. He knew what he had to do. The next step was crucial. Becky would try to deflect, to explain, to justify. He was prepared for it. He had spent the last few weeks silently collecting every bit of information she thought she could hide. Today, he was going to strip away the lies. With one final glance at his laptop, Nathan closed it and stood. He grabbed his keys, walked out of his room, and headed for the parking lot. His mind was calm, methodical. He wasn't doing this for revenge. He was doing this because it was the only way forward. He drove through the familiar streets of Spokane, but everything felt different now. The house they had once shared, his home, loomed ahead. Becky's car was parked out front. For a moment, Nathan thought about the past, the weekends they spent together, the plans they made, the life they built. He pushed the thoughts aside. That was before. This was now. The house no longer held the same meaning. He parked down the street, out of sight, and watched. His heart wasn't racing. It was steady, calm. In the distance, he saw Becky's car leave the driveway. She was headed to Riverfront Park, just like she had planned, no doubt to meet Jeremy. It didn't matter anymore. Nathan had already won this battle without even having to speak to her. Minutes later, he pulled up to the house. The door was locked, but it didn't matter. He had the key. It had been a year since he'd last stepped inside, but it felt like yesterday. The security cameras he had installed several months ago were still active, and Nathan accessed them once more. The footage was clear. He saw Jeremy in the living room, sitting on the couch, chatting with the real estate agent. Nathan's gut had been right, but there was more. As the video continued, the camera picked up the sound of their conversation. Nathan heard Jeremy's voice, loud and clear, speaking to the agent about listing the house. They discussed the price, the details, everything. Nathan's stomach tightened, but his resolve didn't waver. This wasn't just about Becky anymore. It was about a scheme. He sent a text to James, his fingers moving quickly. Security footage uploaded. Jeremy, agent, talking about listing the house. "We're good to move." The phone buzzed almost immediately. "We're on it. Freeze everything." Nathan didn't wait. He stepped inside the house, moving silently through the familiar rooms. There was the kitchen, the one he had renovated with his own hands, and the living room where he had spent countless hours. But it wasn't his anymore. It never would be again. He pulled out his phone and called James. "It's done. The footage is sent. I'm heading to the bank." "Good," James replied. "I've got everything ready on my end. We'll take care of the refinance and freeze the funds. You just keep going." Nathan hung up and walked out of the house, feeling detached from the place that had once meant so much. His next stop was the bank. He had made an appointment earlier that morning, and when he arrived, the loan officer was ready. Nathan showed the officer his military ID, confirming his identity. He laid out the paperwork, the forged documents, the fraudulent refinance application. The officer's face paled as he reviewed everything. "I need to report this immediately," the loan officer said, his voice shaking. "I understand," Nathan said, his voice calm. "I've already filed a police report." As Nathan left the bank, he saw a text from Becky. "Who have you been talking to at the bank?" Jeremy said someone was asking questions. Nathan read the message, then typed a short reply. "None of your business." He hit send, then turned off his phone. No more distractions. It was only when he returned to the motel room where he had been staying that he allowed himself to feel something. Not anger, not sadness, just a quiet satisfaction. The ball was in motion, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the consequences to unfold. James called him shortly after. "We've frozen the refinance funds, but there's more. Jeremy's been arrested. He was driving your truck, Nathan. They pulled him over for a suspended license. He's in custody now." Nathan didn't feel a surge of victory. He didn't feel relieved. He felt only the calm satisfaction of knowing that, for the first time in months, everything was in control. "Good," Nathan said. "What about Becky?" "We're still determining her involvement, but the evidence is stacking up." "She's not out of this yet," James replied. "I don't need to talk to her," Nathan said quietly. "I just want what's mine." The phone call ended, and Nathan took a deep breath, closing his eyes. He had done what he needed to do, and now the truth would take its course. Everything was moving exactly as he had planned. He stood up, packed his bag, and left the motel room. There was nothing more to do. His life was his again, and the rest was just a matter of time. The days that followed felt surreal to Nathan. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the reality of what had happened began to settle in. Becky, once the woman he thought he would grow old with, now became a distant figure in the rearview mirror of his life. The divorce was finalized quickly, and the settlement agreement was straightforward. There was no fight, no bitter custody battle, no drawn-out negotiations. Becky had agreed to forfeit any claims to the house, the pension, and anything they had once shared. It was a quiet, no-fault divorce, a clean break. But as the legal process progressed, Nathan found himself focused on something deeper than the practicalities of splitting their assets. The consequences for Becky and Jeremy were more than just a financial settlement. Jeremy, having been arrested for driving Nathan's truck with a suspended license, was now facing more charges. The investigation into the fraudulent refinance and the larger operation they had been a part of expanded beyond Nathan's own case. He wasn't the only one who had been targeted. The FBI had worked quickly, and within weeks, Jeremy and his accomplice, Daniel Spencer, were facing multiple charges, including fraud, conspiracy, and wire fraud. The amount of money they had siphoned from military families was staggering, but Nathan's case had helped break the pattern. His testimony had been the key that unlocked a broader investigation. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting others who had been victimized in the same way, men and women who had given their all to their country, only to return home to find their lives and families dismantled by a scheme they never saw coming. For the first time in a long while, Nathan felt a quiet satisfaction. He wasn't elated by the downfall of Jeremy or Becky. He wasn't eager for revenge. What he felt was a sense of justice. Justice that had been served not through his own fury or vengeful action but through the cold, unyielding force of the truth. Becky had made her choices, and now, she would have to live with the consequences. But Nathan wasn't in this for the satisfaction of seeing her suffer. His satisfaction came from the knowledge that he had taken control, that he had acted decisively, and that, in the end, he had made sure the wrong was righted. As the weeks passed, Nathan settled into a new routine. His time in the army was coming to a close, and he was preparing for the next chapter of his life. He had decided to take early retirement, not out of bitterness or anger, but because it was time. Time to leave behind the military life that had defined him for so long and start fresh. He had done his part. 20 years was enough. The mission he had been on was now complete. Nathan sold the house in Spokane. It had been a place full of memories, good ones at first, but now too heavy with the weight of betrayal. He needed to move on. He needed to make room for something new. The money from the sale helped fund the next step. He bought a small cabin outside of Missoula, Montana, a quiet place surrounded by nature, with acres of land and a creek running behind it. It was everything he had wanted for the next phase of his life, peaceful, secluded, and entirely his own. He spent his days working on the property, doing carpentry work for locals. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept his hands busy and paid the bills. The work was quiet, satisfying, and a far cry from the noise and chaos of military life. His military pension, steady and reliable, covered the rest. He had made sure of that, preparing for the worst, planning for the future, and ensuring that he would never find himself starting from nothing again. One evening, as the sun set over the land, Nathan sat on the porch of his cabin, a cold beer in his hand. He watched the colors of the sky shift from gold to pink to deep blue, the silence of the vast landscape stretching out before him. It was a far cry from the constant hum of military life, the noise, the pressure. This was peace. It wasn't just about the physical quiet. It was the peace of knowing that he had done the right thing, of knowing that he had faced what had been taken from him without resorting to anger or bitterness. His thoughts drifted, as they often did, to the past. He thought about Becky, about their time together. There were moments of happiness, memories of love that had once been real. He didn't hate her. He didn't even feel much of anything anymore. He had let go, and with that he had found peace. She had made her choices, and he had made his. They were two people on different paths now, and there was no point in clinging to something that no longer existed. A few days later, a letter arrived in his mailbox. It was from a woman in Fort Worth, Texas. She didn't know Nathan, but the FBI had given her his name. Her husband had been deployed when Jeremy and Spencer had tried to run their scheme on her. The letter was brief but sincere. "You don't know me," she wrote, "but you saved our home. Thank you. We're fighting back when it would have been easier to just walk away." Nathan read it twice, letting the words sink in. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a call for recognition. It was a simple thank you from someone whose life had been changed by the very same scheme that had nearly destroyed his own. He pinned the letter to his refrigerator, where it remained as a reminder that his actions had meant something bigger than just his own personal revenge. It had meant justice for others, too. The last time Nathan heard anything about Jeremy, it was through a brief news report. Jeremy had been sentenced to 8 years for his role in the fraud scheme. Spencer had received 12 years. They were paying the price for what they had done. Becky had settled, signing a confession about the forgery and agreeing to a settlement. Nathan had no desire to press charges further, but he had made sure that everything was accounted for. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about making sure they didn't get away with it. As the days turned into months, Nathan found himself moving forward. He was no longer the man who silently suffered, who waited for something to change. He had taken action, stood up for what was right, and in doing so, had reclaimed his life. His journey had been one of quiet resilience, of knowing when to fight, when to wait, and when to let go. The final scene of his old life had played out. The betrayal, the deception, the quiet moments of heartbreak were behind him now. What mattered was the future, one that was entirely his own, free from the past that had once held him captive. And so, as he stood on the porch of his new home, looking out at the sunset, Nathan felt a deep sense of contentment. There was nothing left to prove, nothing more to fight for. He had built something new, something that couldn't be stolen or destroyed. It was his, and it was enough. Sometimes, he thought to himself, justice doesn't come with a bang. Sometimes it just comes quietly, like the sunset. And with that thought, Nathan turned and walked back inside, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring.